Hello, I don't have your window up yet, and I can't see if anybody is saying anything, so let me go and deal with that. I had to answer one of my trolls. Not really a troll, but somebody I don't see eye to eye with. And for heaven's sake, what's going on over here? Something bad is happening over here. People harassing me on the phone. Sending machines over to say, can we improve your Google listing? We've noticed that we haven't improved your Google listing, and they're just liars. This is why I do what I do, is that the world of business is filled with liars and thieves. Let me go and find the live streaming thing so that I can actually see if anybody is saying anything. I'll pop out that window. Oh, here's a couple of folks. Hi, Dima. Boop. If I do that correctly, it may appear in the relevant place. And I got Bernard and Dima, so let me see about sorting that out. Yeah, I have to fix the thing. Just a moment. Boy, oh boy, can I even fix this? Aha! It worked. Okay, I'm a little tired, as you may notice. I will hang in there and get by. Let's see. If I reshape this like this, yeah, that looks about right. I'm fixing all the things. Hi, Chris. Okay. And lastly, I will send this page over to Air Windows or possibly GitHub. Yeah, maybe GitHub will be more appropriate in the event that I need to look up anything. Okay. Hi, I'm here. I made my coffee and has not drank it. And as you might imagine, I'm kind of tired. This last week has been pretty challenging, although I won't say it hasn't been rewarding in a special way. Dither float. That is what I have done. Yeah, you know, I just now responded to somebody, and I think it was the Dither Float Gear Sluts thread. And you have to bear in mind the context of all of this, otherwise things can get kind of unreasonable. They were replying to some kind of UAD poll or something like that, and UAD asked, like, what can we do to make things better for you? And I think in all sincerity they wrote, why don't you do the Air Windows model? And I'm like, oh, no. Be nice. Don't say things like that. You know, I am barely supporting myself, and I live in Vermont in a house that's low-income housing. Yeah, don't ask other people to do this. It's not kind. They'd have to be very committed to this kind of stuff that I'm doing. Otherwise, it's just pointless. I have set up this week to be a little bit more relaxing, although honestly, the week might find me tinkering with hardware toys and stuff. But if I'm enjoying that, then hey, there's nothing wrong with that. This isn't as directly productive because it is fooling around with something that wouldn't necessarily translate to plugins and the main line of things that I do. But I do feel like I've come up with a way of, like, if I can come up with ways of doing things like this, then I can make them for me, and I can also sell individual ones. And if I can sell individual ones, then that can be the sort of thing where it's like what a market will bear. I don't like the idea of that kind of stuff, but I also, there's only one of me, and I can't be sitting around making thousands of these. So it's more like, you know, artisan creation, and it's like, okay, so if you had a needlepoint made by, I don't know, JFK or something, then it's like, oh my goodness, and it's incredibly expensive, even though it's not really a very good needlepoint. So, hey, Bo. Hey, David, Dima. This is a good time for you to ask your small question about that. I am totally building my own Eurorack things. I've even been coming up with some of the answers for how that's done. Like, here is where I've gotten to so far. If I take a little piece of pegboard like this and drill holes where you see the faint little markings, this is the correct place to put a hole for the screws that hold it on. And then there's room for 2 rows of jack that fit in like this. And these are where the holes would be. Or something like this. These are where the holes would be for putting a backplane on it. And if I can put a backplane on the jacks, then the whole thing is more mechanically solid, and there's more room to put more parts on. So yeah, this is the thing, and it's the thing that I'm fooling with. I'll see where I get with that. It would be very comparable to the boutique pedal market. You're absolutely right, Chris. In every way, because I've also identified why some of the boutique pedals sound better than the mass-produced ones. And I can do that in Eurorack bits. So I'll be building individual things, and hopefully they will have that same kind of mojo going on, because I'll be using the same techniques to get it. It has a lot to do with, like, the build techniques of, say, the old Beatles tube recording equipment and stuff like that, which is mostly, it's built on a large scale, and the wires for carrying signal are big heavy wires rather than being flimsy little traces. So yeah. You know, I'll tell you about the FLAC player finger drum. I have recently hunted for a FLAC player myself, because I wanted something that I could play FLACs at various places from, and I was playing some FLACs in QuickTime. In fact, one of my recent Music Jam things. And I got frustrated because it's like, okay, it plays the FLAC just fine, and then it calculates wrongly and runs out of time. And it stops before the music is over, because it was one of the live streams, so it was 2 hours. I was like, oh, God, I can't use QuickTime for this after all. Movie player will not work. So I went looking for something that would. And I found a OS X FLAC-capable music player called Cog. And Cog is pretty minimalist, and it seems to play fine, and it does play FLACs. And it even has a SRC section inside it. It doesn't do the thing where it changes the sample rate for you, and I do like that. But it has a SRC section inside it, and one of the options in the SRC section is sync interpolation. So as for all practical purposes, this is what I'd use. If you're on the Mac, it is a continuation of somebody else's open source project that somebody abandoned. Because that's the thing, if you have like open source projects and people who are not making any money and they're doing nice generous things for people, eventually like they get sick or die or give up. And I'm weird, I don't give up easily, so there's that. But then a lot of these people making things, they don't have an audience. They can't do like a live stream and talk to the people, and the people go, oh, yay, thanks. And that keeps you going. So, and also they may have to, like, failing to have an audience and not having a Patreon, they may also not be making money to continue doing their open source work and have to stop because they don't have time anymore because they had to go to work. But Cog is a OS X port of somebody else's abandoned open source project, and the guy that took it on has been maintaining it. It's fairly current, and so far I've been happy enough with it. And I think it is continued. It continues to be an open source project, but I can't really help with it because the thing about that, and I'd like to, maybe I'll come up with a way of doing it. That'd be cool. But the thing about that is if I went and looked at the open source code for Cog, I'd probably find that it was complicated and baffling to me because it's all that OS grade, dealing with the operating system, loading files, all that kind of stuff. So, further questions. Question from Dima. Does your newly updated plugin know if the next plugin calculates the audio one? Nope, it does not. It doesn't know anything of the sort. Basically, the plugins that dither to floating point do that inside themselves. So each one is a little unit that's not causing any damage to the sound in the realm of truncation. That's all that means. It doesn't do anything further. It doesn't affect other people's plugins, anything like that. It's just you put that little unit in there and then it does whatever it does without adding truncation noise on its output. So the Buttercomp and then Nebula. Oh, I think I see what you're going after. Here's the deal. If you're on Reaper using VST plugins, Reaper could have two different ways of handling things. And the way that works is if Reaper is running on a 32-bit bus, or if you're using audio units for anything, then what will happen is it will output floating point, 32-bit floating point, and the plugin will dither to that, and then you'll be fine, basically. It's not a big distinction at that point. If you're doing that, it doesn't end up being a big distinction anymore. If Reaper is set to be doing its calculations at 64-bit, as in it's running a 64-bit bus in terms of the word length of the audio that's going through it, then the new version of Buttercomp will dither to 64 bits because it has a special part. It's like the VST code is duplicated, and half of the VST code has floating point input, float inputs and outputs. And then there's a section called double replacing because it uses a technique called replacing to deal with the buffers. And if you're running the double replacing code instead of the first code, it's doing everything using 64-bit doubles, which is the name for a 64-bit floating point. And if it's doing that, then my plugin dithers to 64 bits, and then Nebula, assuming Nebula doesn't do this, then Nebula directly outputs 64 bits, and neither of them will go to a 32-bit floating point of any kind. So also, and this is something I don't know about, but I do wonder, if anybody who's using it, and I have tried Reaper, but I haven't done much with it because the music stuff that I do is essentially analog. That's where I get the inspiration for doing this other stuff. Not all VST plugins will implement the double replacing. So, 30. I've never heard of 39-bit integer. Is that really a 39, or do you mean 32-bit integer in Reaper? And what kind? Because that only establishes more what I was about to say. If you have a DAW and you're loading a VST plugin that only has the original sound editing, like one copy of it, and it doesn't have the double replacing routines, and it doesn't say that it does. My question is, does Reaper still let you use that plugin, or does it say this doesn't communicate with our bus? Because if it uses the plugin, what it will do is what they call cast the input word of a double to 32-bit. Exactly, Dima, that would show you. To 32-bit to run that one plugin, and then take the 32-bit out from that one plugin and put it back on the bus. And still will bitter, which is, I think, the only thing that really gives you a good window into the bit depths of the underlying stuff. If you do that, and they would be doing much the same thing that I was doing as far as the dither is concerned. It's like taking the audio word and sort of doing stuff with individual bits in that word. There's probably cool things that I can do in terms of a, if not a bit crusher, then you know, I've been having an eye on a circuit bender plugin, and I've been assuming that what I'd need to do is like convert things to 16-bit words like in CD, and then circuit bend that by manipulating the different bits in it, and then put the remainder of what the floating point value was on. But technically I could be doing that in 32-bit. It would just be a lot more complicated, or indeed 64-bit. It would be messy trying to implement in that way. Yeah, so VSTs will typically not have this double replacing. I'm assuming when you put my VSTs in there, they do show up at 64, because that's the whole point of me doing that. So if it wasn't using it, I would be pretty put off. Yeah. James asked a question: is it possible to emulate the sampler algorithms from analog hardware? I've tried. I haven't really succeeded, but I have tried. Dang, 39-bit integer. I wonder how they worked that out. Well, I've got some pieces of paper here. This might be a fine time. Here, I'll tell you what. Give me a second. I need to grab my my Sharpie, and I'm also going to make my answering machine throw away this garbage. Thank you. I got one of those answering machine messages, and it was from people going, "We can help you improve your Google listing. Did you know that your Google listing is, you know," and they're scammers. They're scammers. They're just trying to take your money. They're not really doing anything. But they're tireless. Spam is tireless. And the criminals seem to have the most money because presumably criminality works. But so here's the deal. So let's pretend that this is 8 bits, right? You could have more, but we're going to start with like 8 bits. And you take the audio coming in, and it's like, okay, this is turned into an 8-bit word. Now, those are all zeros because they're not filled in, but and imagine that you've got an audio word where it's like, okay, those ones are filled in, so it's whatever number is this bit pattern. One of the things that has been done in circuit bending typically, especially with stuff like there's certain old Casios and things that do this, where they're working with a digital audio reconstruction system, but it's really old and primitive. And so they're doing something like some kind of primitive FM generation thing, but their digital to analog converter is crude as hell. it's like some old Casio keyboard or whatever. So not only is it a FM synthesis sort of tacky presets, but it's running everything through a converter that's like out of an Apple II or something like that. It's just these very cheaply made, these cheap antique chips, and it's not a modern converter in any sense of the word. If it was modern, they'd be using something good that would be almost free to build into the circuit. This is back when they had to build stuff sort of, bit by bit, literally. So the thing about it is, if you have an old keyboard or something like that that's making its sound and the audio is being generated and you have your analog output and it's circuit bendable. And I think this may also I'm not sure how much of this is true for things like speak and spells, which are your classic circuit bending targets. But if something is old and has a primitive digital to analog converter, it could very well have banks of like circuit traces, and they're going along and they're going here and there and stuff, but they're in a little row, and that row is literally the bits of the output word. And then what you're doing is you're doing things like shorting together, put a jumper there, and then all of a sudden bit 3 and bit 5 can only go on or off together. Because if this one is powered, it's also powering this one, and vice versa. And that'll screw up the sound big time and have a big, nasty, gritty artifact. And some of your circuit bending with old digital machinery like that, it can make quite horrific noises, and if somebody's familiar with circuit bending, they know that. I like it myself. I haven't done much of it, but I have a great fondness for the kinds of heinous noises that kind of stuff can make. And, or you take this and there's an analog oscillator or something, or a filter or something like that, and so you patch that to one of the bits for no reason. Like just for laughs because it was a ridiculous thing to do. Or you ground one of them. Like you ground this bit and then it can never go on. And maybe it breaks the machine, but maybe it just grounds the bit, at which point you have a hole in your output word and that can never go to 1 because you've grounded it. And it's stuff like that. If you touch something, you're putting a resistance between perhaps ground and that point in the circuit. So you can take it and as it's sending these bits to the reconstruction, to the DAC, you're touching the thing and you're making it go insane because the resistance that you're putting in between the bit that you're touching and ground is enough to make it intermittent. Circuit bending is weird stuff, but it works in this way. And when I talk about doing a plugin, there's no reason I can't take the input signal, scrunch it into 8 bits, and or 16 bits or 32 bits, and go like, okay, if either of these is 1, then they're both 1. Or if this is 1, it's now a dither, it's now a random voltage, so it's flipping on and off randomly. Just all of those different kinds of things that you can do, and it'll make a lot of crazy interference. Like if you replace one of the on bits of a digital word with a, say, a dither noise, like it's supposed to be either 0 or 1, but instead, if it is 1, you're going to behave as if it's being interfered with. So if it's 1, then roughly half the time it's actually going to be 0, and it's a random function. That does a really aggressive mess into the audio in a very specific way, and it's not just only dither noise, because it's bringing noise into it, but in a very controlled and specific way. It's bringing noise into it in only one bit of the output word, so the interference that it has only affects when the signal was going to be 1. If the signal was going to be 0, it leaves it alone. And that has a sort of analogification quality to it. I'm making a note because this is probably what I'm going to do. Not necessarily this week. I have Pathfinity to put out, but it's definitely one of the ways you could do it. And you could pick whichever bit you wanted. So you set the thing up and it's like, okay, this interferes with on bits wherever they may be. You select the bit that you want to interfere with, and then you start bringing up the dither. You maybe have a couple of different ones like that. And you start getting this grungy noise. It's very circuit bendy because it's literally how circuit bending works. You know, or you could force them to ones. It's almost better to force them to zeros, though, because all zeros is probably going to be silence, whereas all ones is probably going to be high voltage. And messing with circuit bending can give you DC offsets, can give you all that kind of crazy stuff. I may have to go and poke my fire. I have switched back over to heating with firewood, but for that reason, I'm running the fireplace, and as the logs burn down, I typically have to shuffle them around a little bit. There is no reason I can't do it at high bit rates. The trick would be doing it maybe... I wonder whether it would be useful to, for the purposes of VSTs or whatever, cast the 64-bit stuff to 32-bit for the purpose of just doing that. And I could do the same thing that I was going to do with the 16-bit, which is also a possibility of yeah, I could run that in the double replacing kind of thing and preserve whatever the 64-bit stuff had, but be interfering with all the bits above that just by casting it to float, saving the remainder, putting the remainder back once I'm done. But and in the 32-bit level, you'd be basically just interfering with it and interfering with individual bits as part of the mantissa. Actually, that's kind of an insane idea. Cool. Maybe we have a new thing. Because the whole point of the demonstrating the exponent is that there's two ways you can mess with the circuit bending rather than just the one. And circuit bending is traditionally only a fixed point, but circuit bending on floating point numbers could be very amusing. I could pick out, like, it's dangerous, though. I'm not sure how dangerous, but if I circuit bent the mantissa, it would be generating the same level of nastiness and on all levels at once. And that could be cool. That would be kind of tracking the amplitudes of things in a way that wouldn't happen with just straight up bit crushing. If you're messing with the exponent, on, you know, the best that can happen in practical terms is that you're always making the exponent be less by interfering with it. So you'd be doing stuff that you'd be needing to do stuff that was the silencing things, and that would be drastically cutting out the amplitude in an irregular way. But if you were adding bits rather than subtracting them, if you were making bits go on rather than off, and assuming that the exponent is arranged in such a way that more bits on is higher, there's the possibility of pushing the wrong bit and having the output be 600 dB over clipping. I'll leave you with that for a moment while I poke my fireplace. 600 dB over clipping. That would be very helpful for your monitor speakers. Your ears will love that. We'll try to avoid making that possible. No good will come of it. All right, that'll hold the fire for a moment. But yeah, that's the whole concept of the circuit bendy kind of thing, is manipulating the bits in the audio word, but we don't necessarily have to convert stuff to 16-bit fixed point like some kind of old school thing in order to manipulate them. So (32-bit floating point circuit bend). Yeah, if you're in the southern hemisphere, I bet it's warm at this point. But yeah, okay, so guys, thanks. I guess you just redefined what I'm going to attempt when I do attempt the circuit bend, because there's no reason to restrict it to 16-bit words as if it was old school stuff. I can do the circuit bendy type stuff just as easily on a floating point. And oh, video on how to convert junk mail into, well, the stuff I was talking about earlier wasn't so much junk mail as it was people hammering my telephone landline, because I don't talk to people on a cell phone. I have one, but it's really old, and I use it basically as a tricorder. I keep notes on it, and I can take photographs on it and stuff like that, but it's not for talking to people on the phone with. And so when I complain about people bugging me, it's because spammers are calling me up on the telephone literally all the time. And it's always the same ones. Nobody else seems to be on this tip, but for some reason there's a batch of them that are like, we need to update your Google listing. Pay us to update your Google listing so that you will return higher in Google search results. And they're scammers. They're up to no good. But they say Google will not actually call you at the house, even though the people try to make themselves seem as if they are Google themselves. But Google will not call you at the house and try to get you to give them money over the phone to give you a better Google. It's kind of absurd. You know, as evil as Google is, that is not where they make their money. So it's like, nope. So, yeah, Dima has mentioned a thing. Purist Gain now has Dither inside. There's no reason I couldn't make a pan plugin. I just haven't yet. Yeah, I'll make a little note of that, because that's one of the things that I could tack on. It's not super difficult. It's more a matter of, like, what's the pan law that you're using? Like, how much quieter does it get if you bring both of them in? I have also wondered about doing, like, pan that involves timing of delays to either side so that you have a little bit of a binaural effect. You know, in the simplest form, there could be a multi-leveled pan law thingy. So in a more complicated form, you can have a pan that has binaural effects, where the sound is coming from a direction and it hits one ear a measurable time before it hits the other ear. So you have inter-speaker time differences. And that's also, that has something to do with, like, holographic sound techniques. And the Pink Floyd album, The Final Cut, was using a thing called Q-Sound that is kind of like that. And anybody that uses a dummy head for recording is using a process like this. But then there's another thing which could be done which is the deal is, if you're doing just straight pan law, then the two sides are going to be at the same time at all times. So they won't interfere. Chris, I have one. Go ahead and download it. In fact, if you've downloaded the recent new updates, you've already got it. Go and check out ADT. It's ADT2. That's what that is. You're welcome. It's always kind of fun when that happens. People are like, can you please make me this thing? I'm like, I've already got it, dude. Check your download. But the pan law affects things. And then, yeah, absolutely. So that's why I'm taking this seriously. There's no reason I can't build a pan that works in the same way, especially now that I'm dithering the things. It may as well include that. Binaural would mean that you're delaying one channel or the other based on what's going to go to the far ear. But binaural does not crunch down into mono effectively, and there are still reasons for dealing with mono, like cell phone outputs and things like that. We don't really listen to radio that compresses down to mono anymore. But if you listen to anything, any set of speakers, and walk far enough away from it, it's going to become effectively mono. You know, maybe not quite as much if you're to the side of the speakers, but there very much is in Air Windows ADT. Go ahead and use it. If you have your speakers like I have right there, and I had the capacity to walk down the street, at a certain point it's going to be effectively mono because the radial different distance between the speakers, you got a speaker here and a speaker here, and you're sitting here, and then you walk farther and farther away, and it's just effectively the distance, angled distance between the speakers gets less and less the farther away you go from it until it's effectively mono. So mono still has relevance even if you're only using stereo speakers. But then there's a trick that I worked out that I haven't done yet, but I'm intending to do it. And if anybody is a dev and is watching this stream, go ahead and give this a try. When I do interpolation for handling sample rate stuff, and it doesn't actually line up with individual sample positions, I typically like doing either linear interpolation or making it a little bit more complicated. And linear interpolation is the one where effectively, if you interpolate to exactly halfway between two samples, you're averaging them. You're averaging them at half the volume from each. And when you average two samples, you have a filter right there. I see no reason why you couldn't have a pan that applied up to 50% interpolation on the farthest, the one that's getting muted most, the farthest of the pan things. And that would make two things, because on the one hand, your nearest ear, where it's panned over to here, so you're hearing it through this ear, that's going to be brighter. Even in real life, it's brighter. If you're listening to something from directly in front of you, you're not going to get quite as much highs as if the thing is somewhat to the side. There is a Howard Hughes was involved in making a 3D spatializer simulator, and a guy that I know, I'd like to call him a friend, Chad Clark of Beauty Pill. I'm a big fan of his anyhow, whether he's my personal friend or not. Is a big fan of this Howard Hughes stereo widener thingy. And it uses stuff like that. It uses boosts and cuts and emphases of various kinds. And that's probably another good candidate for me to do something like that. But if you're listening to something that's over to the side, the ear that is closer to the thing is going to be brighter. And then the ear that is farther from the thing, it's going to have your head in the way, and you're just not going to get the high frequencies out of it. So taking a pan and essentially delaying one of the sides, but not in a full binaural way, just by like what would work out is, here's where the sound is coming from. The binaural delay factor would be like this. Like the near one would be here, and the far one with the interpolation between the current sample and the previous sample is only going to seem to be this much farther away. But tonally, you can do a very clean averaging filter by just averaging between the two, and you could go to, average current sample with the previous one and have that be the far side from the panning, and you'd be getting a degree of you'd be getting a tiny amount of time interference, and you'd be getting a tiny amount of tonal interference. And I think those things would be consistent with simulating your binaural kind of effect. So that would be a good thing to include with the pan. And I'm not sure whether it would need to go to a place where your panning thing was making that channel just plain disappear. Like if you had the two, because in the real world, if you have a sound and you pan it all the way over to the side, you can still hear it with the other ear. It doesn't cut out entirely. So there's probably a blend there. You could have maybe things like this, where you'd be setting it so that it's like, okay, when we pan, we lose half of the pan volume. We don't have any of the severe delay added, but we're using all of the really tiny delay just to get between samples. That could be a separate stage even. And then your overall pan control would be an entirely separate control, but as you manipulated it, it would be using each of these techniques to whatever degree you told them to be. And that's probably what the Air Windows pan would need to become. So again, this is not coming next week. PAFNAUDIO is coming next week, but when I do the pan thing, I think I can do it that way. That should work. That way, if you had it set with only pan volume and both of the other ones were not on at all, then you'd have strictly a pan volume, maybe different kinds of pan laws. And then you could bring those other ones in to whatever extent you wanted, and they would start to stack up and have more of an effect. Like the interpolation thing is a filtering effect. And binaural, since the delayed one is always, if there's any interpolation in the measurement, then the delayed one is the one that is going to be both farther away and filtered slightly by its interpolation. Binaural could be adding another layer of this 50% interpolation, but it would also, if I made it be fixed point where it'd be a distinct number of samples, and you'd scale it up by manipulating the control, it could sort of click from position to position, and you'd have whole number sample delays until you reach the full width of a dummy head, which is not many samples, by the way. You'd reach the full width of your dummy head thing, and at that point, each of the individual positions would not have the interpolation added to them. And what that would do, because the interpolation is a separate slider, remember, what that would do is let you do this timing delay thing with except no, that wouldn't work perfectly, would it? I was just thinking that doing the pan control itself would be applying a greater or lesser delay. So all of the binaural concepts involve gradually going through a series of samples, and some of that is going to involve interpolation. So yeah, maybe it's not a perfect design. I can probably make it anyway, even if it's not perfect. The worst that would happen is you'd use the binaural, you'd use the 50%, and you'd wind up with a double averaging where you only needed a single one. And manipulating the binaural control, it's like as you do the delayed one, this happens in Golem, by the way, so it's not like it's never happened before. As you move the delayed one, it goes through interpolated places to whole sample delays. And so it would go from dull to bright to dull to bright to dull to bright as you moved the control, which is not great, but then at the same time, binaural delays in pans is not automatically great either. So you sort of takes your chances as far as that's concerned. Analog pans, huh? You know, one of the interesting things about that is when I make a new board, and I got this Roland board that I'm mixing all of the electronic stuff through, and I'm going to think of it. I'm going to take a moment. I haven't seen people talking in a second, so I seem to be still streaming. I look like a pile of mush in this bathroom. I should sit up and look more attentive. It's silly. Granted, I'm tired, but come on. Come on. The thing about analog pans is that when I build a board to replace this one that I've got over here, and it's probably going to be based on like Eurorack sized modules and have some kind of thing going on where I work out a way to use that concept to make lots and lots of little channels and then power and use those. I'm almost certainly not going to have pan pots. Instead, I'm going to have LCR. And when I say LCR, what I mean is I'm going to have LCR that has pretty much infinite ultimate stereo width from the left and right channels, because I know how to do that. What I'll need to do is make, essentially, I'll draw a picture of that too, just a moment. Because I like panning to LCR, but one of the problems is if you have pan pots, then you always have a narrowing of output width. Like you're going to have some crosstalk, so you're going to have left bleeding into the right, and it's going to narrow that kind of stuff down. But if I do LCR, what I could do is this. It's left, center, or right panning, and 4 output summing amplifiers. Like the left summing amplifier, the bus has its own summing amplifier. Right has its own summing amplifier in the bus. And center drives 2 summing amplifiers instead of 1. And the outputs of those get summed into the output left and right channels. So left stuff, there's no path through which resistances can bleed it into the right channel. And it keeps everything clean, and it also means that everything that I patch into the center, which is always the most important stuff, has double summing amplifiers to power it to the output bus, rather than splitting the force of it through resistances and making it go to the output channels on a less direct path than the left and right stuff does. So that's the technique that I would use for the mixing board thing that's going to replace the one that I've got over there, because as nice as it is, and it is kind of nice, it has the channel mute switches are all scratchy and stuff, and I can do better sound-wise. I mean, I'm enjoying the filters and stuff that it's got. It's got 16 channel EQs on it. It's high sweepable mid and low. And that's fine, but I find that I'm using a lot of those things to be as flat as I can get them. Maybe they have a little bit of lows boost in certain places, or maybe not, or maybe they, like the guitar, I'm using a little tone shaping on the guitar mic, but technically I don't have to. And there's been a lot of good sounds, including sounds like guitars, where you want to have some edge and stuff to them. Oh yeah, no, I just have a long delay, that's all. And that's just streaming. That's what streaming does. So, even with regards to like my guitar, where I've thrown a bunch of lows on it, because what I'm using, the speaker doesn't have lots of lows or anything like that. But I could just as easily wire up a custom channel for just that, which automatically has some lows boost in there, and design it just the way I want to. And for all the stuff that I'm not doing things with the EQ, I would kind of like to be able to switch those out. And on that Roland, you can't. They're just all, everything runs through whatever everything runs through. And some of my stuff has a lot of gain on the inputs, like the guitar is the microphone input, and I cranked it way up. And other things, particularly if I run like something through one of my distortion boxes, the level coming into the thing is so hot, or like raw Eurorack output is, like 10 volts. And so running that into a mixer, you're practically padding it down. It's turned way down. And Dima, you're absolutely right that the summing amplifiers have some character, and I'm working on concepts for that as well. I'm thinking about running parallel summing amplifiers, one of which has a very clean sound, and the other one of which has massive slew restrictions or something like that. Or saturation, But yeah, there are things that I can do that I always have done in analog, that it's been a long time since I've done that. So yeah, Dima, I think I've come up to where, apart from things like DIY set, and I'm thinking about making, getting together my collections of various stuff, because I have a tendency of getting like so many jacks, so many little pieces of perf board and stuff, that I'd be able to put together kits and sell them to people. That might or might not be a thing where I'd be trying to like, okay, so maybe I can actually make some money and not be poor, or I want to give people these tools, and so this one's going to be like just at cost. Hard to tell. Depends. Like if it's a kit of something that I designed and built myself, I'd probably have it be a little fancier. And if it's like, here is your experimenter kit, and have a collection of all of the stuff that I've bought in like, because here's how that works. Right now, I have over there a rack from like Michael's that is all these little boxes that are used for holding greeting cards or whatever it is that you do when you go into a Michael's. And a bunch of them now have anti-static foam in the bottom of them, and whole sets of CMOS chips. I got 4049s, I got 4017s, I've got 40106, which is a Schmidt trigger hex inverter. And all of these have their own little purposes, and many of them are really cool. Like there's a guy who's written a series of posts on a site called Hackaday, and he was making oscillators and things that are just raw CMOS, just raw chips. Hook a battery up to it, and then wire these two parts onto it, and burp, you've got a square wave, And part of that is the oscillators are the 40106s. Those are Schmidt trigger inverters, meaning that they will change state, but they have to go a certain amount to exceed what they call hysteresis in the middle. So they can't just equal out at zero. They have to go between a plus and a minus voltage. And That chip, all you have to do is put a feedback thingy and a capacitor, and that's it. It's an oscillator. In fact, you can put a potentiometer, a knob, and a capacitor, and it's a tunable oscillator, and it's a very clean little square wave too. And with this chip, you have 6 of them. You can use 6 of them all at the same time. So the idea there is I could set people up with these parts fairly easily just by knowing, like, okay, I need to get this much static, anti-static stuff, and I get these chips, and I get these, this, and this, that. It wouldn't involve enclosures and things because those get damn expensive. On the other hand, it would involve things like, check this out. I have plenty of pegboard now. I went and got serious amounts of pegboard, so if I do this, you might end up getting sent pieces of literally this pegboard for the DIYer kind of thing. And if I did it in a way that was self-sustaining, I could afford to get more. Because that's like $120 worth of pegboard. The chips, like this chip is more like 26 cents. But the thing is, if you were going to have a full collection, you'd have like 3, 6, 7. You could have as many as 10 different chips, and that becomes $2.60. And they're 26 cents when you buy them by the 100. So you can have your, 26 bucks 1 month, and now you have 100 of these chips. And I have 100 of a bunch of those chips. But then if you're trying to get all of them, that becomes more expensive. You're spending hundreds of dollars just on large collections of the full diversities of chips. And if I was setting people up with DIY or Tinkerer stuff, what I'd be doing is going here, have a couple of this and a couple of this and a couple of this. You now have 2 each of all these CMOS things to play with. 2 or more because in case you break them. Because CMOS is sensitive to static electricity. Like this one sitting in here could conceivably already be dead if I touched it the wrong way. And electric shock hit it. If they're sitting in the anti-static stuff, they're fine, but they are fragile. And if you zap them with a static zap, they're just toast. So you'd want to send people more than 1 copy of each chip because they're only 26 cents each. And ideally, you'd be able to experiment with them and still keep going if you blew something up or wired it wrong. And yeah, like these jacks are 60 cents, maybe, something like that. Enough that I was able to get a big old pile of them. They're weird because if you tighten them too much, they break. They're maybe not the best jacks in the world, but they're among the cheapest jacks in the world, and they're pretty solid for what they are. And to set people up with just piles of stuff, lots and lots of parts. That's another possibility lurking around, ready to be done. So, I've got some discussion by Dima. Some questions about bit shift gain. So, bit shift gain is exactly what you need for changing 6 or 12 dBs because it takes the audio and it's literally exactly utterly the same, just at a different exponent. So bit shift gain is useful that way, and no, I can't do a recalculation in smaller volume differences because it's changing the exponent. One thing that could happen is that if you did change it by, because all it's doing is it's multiplying by a number and controlling the number very carefully. Like if bit shift gain is giving you 6 dB, it is multiplying the numbers coming in by exactly 2. Like literally exactly 2. And then the next one is multiplying the number by exactly 4, and that gives you 12 dB of gain. And technically, you could multiply the number by 3, at which point some of the output values would land exactly on the same bit that it was, but some of them would be the worst case scenario. They'd be making the largest change in between them, so I don't think it's valuable. to do that. If you needed smaller differences, use purest gain, because that'll give you any difference that you want and it's dithered. So yeah, once it's calculating, it would be purest gain. There is no recalculation algorithm without shifting bits. Like bit shift gain literally is just only shifting bits. And there is no recalculation algorithm that would work across all of the bits of the mantissa beyond just doing any gain change that you want and then dithering it. It's one of those things. It's like, unless you can change the exponent directly, which is what bit shift gain does, you're doing an alteration, and at that point, just dither it. And that completely removes any distortion that it might incur from having the bits be misaligned. That's literally, it's a complete solution. Bob Olson was talking in one of the threads on Gearsluts, and he was pointing out that it was frustrating to him. People think that dither covers up noise. Dither does not cover up noise. I've drawn this picture many times on my little notes pieces of paper. What dither does a statistical averaging. 1 hour gone, says Bernard. Okay, I'll drink some coffee. How's that? 1 hour gone. Stop talking. If you are dithering, you're taking, and here's something. Okay, I am going to jump on this because I got heckled. I got heckled by my buddy who deletes his posts when I respond to them. He was like, "Shut up! Don't tell people these lies about stair-stepping. You know that it's not really stair-stepping, it's just points." And I was like, first of all, it's not points either. It's a reconstructed waveform with more than one point defining where the waveform goes. So, got you there. And secondly, when you do truncation, it absolutely is stair-stepping. If you have a smooth waveform going through a point, and this is what it's supposed to be, and you have truncation positions here, then, here, let's add a curve to make even more stair-stepping. If you are truncating, you're literally getting this out. You can say all you want, like, oh, there's no stair steps in digital audio. Hell, there aren't. If you're truncating, you literally have stair steps in the output of the digital audio. The reconstruction filter might smooth them out a little bit. Literally what you'll get once you're finished doing that is, let me see, smaller pen. Something more like this. See how there's a little edge there? And that's what the reconstruction filter will do when confronted with just only this value and then suddenly only this value, is there's a little overshoot before and after. That's what the reconstruction filter does. No, it's not Fabian. It is not Fabian. There's another guy, let me remember if I can remember his name, I'll go back to YouTube for long enough to see. And I'll tell you it so that you don't think it's Fabian, because Fabian's fine. He hasn't been heckling me about anything. Yep. No, it's not Fabian. It is a German fellow by the name of Erwin Vomberg. And I've been crossing swords with this guy because he likes to jump all over me, specifically on YouTube comments. He doesn't show up in other places. And people heckle him sometimes in the YouTube comments, but, he wants to be visibly fighting with somebody that people are paying attention to. That's legit. I mean, I get that. I totally get that. I do find it a little annoying because he talks really mean at me sometimes, and I just have to deal with it. But yeah, if you are truncating, you absolutely are getting stair steps at the levels of quantization. That is what it is doing. That is the shape you're getting. It's not supposed to be that way, but you're not supposed to be truncating. And if you are dithering, you're still only getting those points, but the result is that you get a fuzzy looking thing and it follows the same contour as the underlying waveform. And that is the truth. So yeah, no, it's not Fabian that I'm talking about. It's this other fellow. And he is a big thinker, this guy. We don't agree in many things. One of the things that makes him angry and makes him yell at me about stuff is when I say analog is just better and all of my stuff is designed to bring analog to digital waveforms, and he doesn't understand the idea at all. He's like, there's no stair steps, there's no anything, all of that is nonsense, digital is just perfect. I like it better than anything else. I'm like, cool, you go ahead and like what you like. That doesn't mean I have to feel the same way about it, and I have been addressing some of the problems that I have found. Oh no, oh no. David has gotten involved with, oh no, well, yes, David posts under the name of the Muzzle 3, if I'm not mistaken, and, if I've got that wrong, then please correct me, because I think that I recognize you, and that's who's doing it. Be careful with Reddit. I tend to not touch Reddit too hard, and you know, it is going to end up, people will act like it's snake oil and spammy stuff. I know Snake Oil is another guy. In fact, I started supporting that guy's Patreon. I liked what he was doing. And that doesn't mean that he's not... I'm not sure if there's anything in Ditherfloat for him to review. He's talking about stuff that you run music through. Ditherfloat is really not a thing to run music through unless you're saving to 32-bit floating point out of a 64-bit bus. And yeah, I prefer dealing with people who, if you are nice to them and sort of persistent and patient and rational, that they don't flip out and start yelling at you. Fabian could very easily be somebody like that. I don't notice him responding to the stuff that I was saying. I did say, yeah, I take that as a challenge. I'm going to come up with a way of dithering floating point. And I did, although I'm not the only person in history ever to think of this. I think Fabian might even be the guy who was responsible for analyzing a bunch of different dither algorithms. I'm not sure, but there have been folks who have done rigorous analysis of that stuff, or rigorous analysis of sample rate conversions, and this is a vital role to play. Like, I don't play that role, and I don't need to. My role is coming up with things, you know, like a way of making an analog bus that has no crosstalk, or a way of doing pan pots in such a way that you can incorporate these various different things. Oh no, CJ, first of all, I don't know who CJ is, and second of all, there's a forum in Russian with people just yelling at me. I can't see why. Oh dear. I have a tendency of wanting to go and see things like that, but sometimes it's not a good idea. Never mind that people wouldn't like me to be dismayed by running across stuff like that. But yeah, the most recent cross with the fellow on YouTube was, he was like, stop saying that there is stair steps because you're just lying, it's points. And I was like, no, it's not points, because it's interpolation, not even between points, but around points. Points are just representations of a underlying thing that's defined by a mathematical relationship between the points, but it doesn't follow the points. And secondly, if you truncate, you absolutely have the stair steps. It's not perfect stair steps because they're band limited. This is the picture of what band limiting looks like on a stair step. But if you truncate, you have the stair steps. Literally, that's what happens. Now, interpolation. Yeah, remember folks, never protect me like a lion too much because I can absorb a certain amount of nonsense. It's okay for people to jump up and down and scream and be virulently against stuff that I do. If it's worthwhile stuff, people will like the positive things about it anyway. And if people like that are able to expose actual weaknesses, I benefit because they bring them to me and go, haha, I have found your faults. You have done this wrong. And if it's true, I'll go, oh, okay, I have a bug fix to make. And then I make the bug fix. Oh, cool. There are still people posted to Beatruid. Yeah, Beatruid is the site that I put up, but I don't monitor it, and I don't tell people what to post on it and stuff. And it's just a wiki on, maybe is that the one you're thinking of? It's not a Russian site. Beatruid is not a Russian site. Beatruid is mine, and it's same place as the other sites. But Mute Tourette's has a question that I should probably get into. Is a thing about sync interpolation. And I'm not sure if I can draw this picture, so maybe I'll just try to explain it. Oh, I like people who don't read the manual. I don't read the manual myself. Sync interpolation is also known as like infinite bandwidth resampling. And my favored interpolation library, Secret Rabbit Code, is based on sync interpolation. And then it's also a technique that anybody does. Hang on a second, Dima. My initials are Chris Johnson, namely CJ. And I make Air Windows, and I supply the website for Beatruid, and people get to post to Beatruid all they want, but nobody else made Beatruid. I did. So who's the CJ, and why are you saying they made the Beatruid site? Maybe I've completely misunderstood. Or maybe you're saying they're on Beatruid heavily and they also made the Russian site? That'd be interesting. In any case, let me talk a little bit about the sync interpolation. And I don't think the Benford realness stuff would help within those. That's more of a filtering kind of formula. What sync interpolation does is, and we'll need a piece of paper for this. Say you've got a sample rate that's going by about that fast. And then you have another sample rate that's going by about that fast. Say it's like 96K or like 44.1K. Not an evenly arranged ratio. It's not like every other sample or something like that. Oh, if you edit a page in Beatruid, you are indeed the author of the page that you make. There's no reason not to. It's like go ahead and use it. It's your site. It's a Wikipedia. It's a wiki style site, so you get to have all of that kind of stuff. And I'm not really worried about managing it. It's for users to exchange ideas, and I will keep it going as long as it is useful to people. The idea behind sync interpolation is to be able to reconstruct stuff based on this waveform or this sample rate. And you're using the stuff at this sample rate to reconstruct this waveform and then resampling it at this sample rate. So it's as if you were going out to analog but without additional noise or anything. So sync interpolation is a mathematical way of doing that. It's a mathematical way of filtering it in such a way that you have this recalculation based on what the reconstruction of this sample would be. And it just does it at a very high rate. And the way, when they say sync, what they mean is a kind of sampley thing that's like this. It's a little bit like a wavelet or something like that. And I don't know the exact details, but when you talk about doing sync interpolation, what you mean is taking this high resolution thing, or indeed the other way around. You can start with this and go here, and reconstructing it in such a way that it's like you're running a output, it's like you're running a digital to analog converter in which you've got a FIR filter that's a brick wall filter. And this is what a brick wall filter looks like in FIR. You have a series of samples, space them out however you need, and depending upon where you space the samples, like if there's one at the peak and trough of each of these waves, then that is the highest frequency brick wall filter you can put in. If there was lots of samples along these points, you still have a brick wall filter, but it's at a much lower frequency. And it will refuse to let through anything that's a higher frequency than that. And it is also a linear phase FIR filter, meaning that it responds with no change in phase, and it has this input ripple. Like when a sound comes in, it'll start doing a little bit of a ripple and then decay again once you're finished at the frequency that it's filtering. The brick wall goes up to this point, and then there's a little bit of resonance, but it's not really resonance, it's just the shape of what the waveform is left over. So SRC is indeed filtering, and a sync interpolation is reconstructing this kind of thing on the fly at whatever frequencies you want, and then resampling it based on what you've just reconstructed. And when they do higher low quality, what that means is assume that this is at the highest frequency that you're going to be using. High quality means stretching it out really far to the sides so that these end lobes that trail off into silence stretch way out. The farther they stretch out, the steeper the brick wall filter is going to be, because that's how that works. If you have only a few samples and you're showing only this much of it, that becomes a lower quality filter. It's still sync interpolation, but it is what they would call a low quality sync interpolation. It'll run faster, it'll eat less CPU, and it'll be a slower slope. I think at some point it also starts letting through more aliasing, but I think it also might, rather than letting through more aliasing, just not let as much high frequencies through. So the steepness of the brick wall starts to round off as you have less and less samples as part of this. But the end result of sync interpolation is you're doing that kind of stuff on a set of samples. And this is what I was arguing with Erwin Vonberg about. The samples are not points because you're not actually measuring. I'm actually recycling the drawings. Maybe if they end up being really good or people beg me, like, please can we have your drawings, then I'll come up with a way of doing it. I can sell them on Patreon, bid high on Patreon to get these garbage drawings with the Sharpie. That'd be funny as hell. Yeah, at the moment I'm recycling them. I'm just throwing them into the recycle basket. The interpolation thing is doing this to generate a supposedly analog waveform and then recalculating what the new sync interpolation at a sampling rate of this would be, so that basically you're going from the high sample rate to the low sample rate, and depending upon how much processing power you throw at it, you have a perfect rejection of out-of-bounds information and retain everything in bounds. Now, the downside of the sync interpolation is you're doing incredibly large amounts of calculation, and so if they were doing it, say, all of their calculations are as float, you'd be losing more than you gained. There would be so much of it. And I don't actually know how to do a plugin, at least not yet, that takes in one sample rate and spits out another. Sadly, that's not something that I know how to do. Maybe if I faked it by outputting the higher sample rate and then just sort of stair-stepping it again with linear sample and hold until you get to the new point, and then you essentially, that wouldn't be great though. That's not a good way of doing it either. I don't think you're supposed to burn white paper like this, so I tend to burn brown paper or wood, and even brown paper, that's just kindling. I don't use large quantities of it. So let's see, Bo had a question. It sounds like tempo on song speeds up or down as the volume goes down. I think that might be a psychoacoustic thing. I have heard that mentioned reading about the Rolling Stones of all things. And there's something to do, in that case, I think that would be, they were talking about performing or something like that. Either they were talking about performing, or it was something to do with some audiophile thing, and somebody was listening to Rolling Stones. And the upshot of it was, as you get better, either better groove or better resolution in the playback or something, it starts to sound as if the tempo is slowing. Stuff starts to sound slower and more momentous as the quality of it increases. I'm not sure if that's necessarily so, but I think it's a psychoacoustic thing. The thing to bear in mind about a compressor, Dima, is this. Look, I have 2 pages that I can draw because I didn't make either of these double-sided. And I'm working on this as well. With the compressor, when you're doing gain reduction, it's the same deal. It's like, as long as you're changing gain, you might as well dither, and that's the bottom line. And so as a result, all the compressors that I have now are using dither, so all of them are dithering the gain reduction in order to not have artifacts. So that's basically, that's already there. You know, if you like my compressors, then go and use the new versions of them, and you'll like them even better, because it will help is to having these gain shifts constantly happening from a compressor. You do need to deal with the resolution of it. It's not like a bit shift gain. It's not like you can just, boop, this is a compressor, it suddenly goes to 6 dB down. That's not how that works. The concern with the compressor, and again, I have a plan to do something about this, is that the faster you start to react to input sound going in, you start getting aliasing. So it's, Dima is happy that all of the compressors are now dithered too. Yeah, I said I dithered everything. It was a lot of work. It wiped me out this whole last week. And that's why, because it's worth it, because people get excited, and because if this is the kind of thing that you hear easily, you'll be very pleased with how it sounds. I'm still amazed that people are saying that they're hearing it like immediately, just first off, like, oh, I tried this and it immediately sounded better, and I tried this and it immediately sounded better. I'm thinking you wouldn't be able to double blind test that stuff, but you might be picking up something real anyway, because it is something real. It's just real and mostly inaudible as just one stage. Gamma has a question about capacitor. I think one of the things that you need to bear in mind about capacitor is that when you aggressive, and somebody else was going after me about capacitor and stuff like that. They were automating things, and they were automating a high-pass filter and changing around the high-pass filtering of it, and then suddenly zeroing it out, and they ended up with DC voltage that was persistent. And the reason they got DC voltage that was persistent is a high-pass filter stores energy, and if you put it to 0 suddenly, it's retaining what was there as the energy, but not altering things any further. And so it rather than having the low frequency stuff that's being removed be updated by new information coming in. When you take the high pass filter and then you suddenly zero out the frequency response, you're just keeping whatever it is you kept in there. So you shouldn't do that. It's set up so that it's possible to do that, and that's one of the things that, like, you shouldn't do it that way. It will lead to a persistent DC voltage, because that's just what happens when you change a high pass to 0 hertz. If I put 0 hertz as an available frequency that you can use, and I do that, then especially with these old plugins, if I include 0 hertz as a possible frequency that you can use, you have to deal with the consequences of using it. That's literally what makes DC, is 0 hertz content. And if you're doing the filtering thing, you're accumulating stuff, and then you change the frequency to 0 hertz, and guess what? Whatever it is that you were using is now permanent. Now, as far as the peak around 15 to 18K, if that's something that jumped out, that probably has to do with the way you were automating it. David Pixley is the muzzle, and is very much like I was when I was younger, and always wants to do anything that I say, don't do this. You go ahead and do that if you want. If you like DC, knock yourself out. But yeah, if you have automated it in such a way that the, because it has several different, capacitor has several different ways of handling. It's one of my, it's been a long week, interleaved plugins. So part of its filtration is alternating between one buffer and another. And then part of its filtration, because this is capacitor we're talking about, is alternating between 3 different buffers. And so if you automate the frequencies in the wrong way, and by the wrong way I mean you're doing violent, weird things with it, then what happens is you can have these buffers set up in such a way that they have essentially garbage data. You've changed it in such a way that all of a sudden they're not working like they normally would if it was just being applied from the word go. If you fed the same frequencies and the same audio through capacitor, leaving the controls alone, it's not going to do that. And if you manipulate them with the slider on the screen, most likely you're not going to update it so fast that it's going to freak out. But if you're automating it and making sudden changes all over the place, so you're thinking you were smoothly moving it and it was still doing that? That is a concern. That is a concern. These are ways of dealing with the algorithms that I'm using. Oh, so it was high pass. I mean, presumably what you mean is low pass was down to like nothing. I'll make a little note to myself, which hopefully I'll remember to do, of testing out capacitor, because that's one of the things I want you to be able to do. I thought you'd be able to do that and you wouldn't have a problem. So if you're having a problem doing it, then I need to look into this again. Capacitor rise towards drop. I have a basic idea what that's supposed to mean. Yeah, depending upon the kind of sound that you've got, it's possible there are sounds that would just generate that, but it really shouldn't. You should be able to manipulate it in simple ways like that without... I will look into it, see whether I can get that to go on. And as far as 80 clip is concerned, I wonder, because... There's a thing in 80 clip, or at least has been sometimes, where I'm trying to pass through the input data without touching it, unless it is actively doing its clippy kind of thing. And that means that ADClip is one of the few plugins that will not necessarily denormalize the input. So that's the concern. It's like the idea is I wanted to make a pass-through. Like ADClip is supposed to work in such a way where works in such a way where it should pass through the input word untouched unless it's actually doing its thing. And that's been tricky to do because there have been times where it would cut in and out and you'd get an artifact based on whether it was on or off. There's been times when I think I just shut it off and it was always engaged rather than trying to do the bypassing. But ADClip 7 is one of that series of plugins where I've actively tried to incorporate this bypass switch. And the bypass switch is pass through the input word without touching it. And you need to be able to switch that on and off without making an artifact. But also, if there are denormal numbers in the input word, that guarantees that you have passed it to the output word again. And that, I'm not sure where the denormals are coming from, and I'm not sure why it's the plugin's problem to solve that. But that is one possible cause of creating CPU spikes. In particular, it seems like VST is the place where that was happening, because that is kind of that's what caused the initial denormalization thing back in 2017 or 16. Was people started running into this problem, and yeah. Yeah, I'm going to look into seeing whether I can get capacitor to misbehave for you, Gamma, so that I can see whether I can fix it. So do you mean that it was not switched on and then you switch on capacitor in the middle of the mix? Because I often don't do that. If it's bypassed and then you're switching it on, it might be trying to start from nothing. And capacitor is one of those ones where you're probably better off trying to have it passing signal the entire time. I'm not sure it would behave properly if you use the DAW to kind of cut it in and out. And all of a sudden it's present, but it's an IIR filter, so it needs to have data to be working on in order to pass real information. So you'd be better off doing some kind of bypassing thing that still incorporated sound passing through it. That's another possibility. And in Fruity Loop Studio's parametric EQ is standard biquad filtering type of stuff. Oh, okay, that might be a thing. Biquad filtering is a very simple way of managing frequencies with just a few samples of delay on both the output and the input, and it's the normal DAW filtering thing. If you are using biquad filtering, that can do all kinds of high passes and low passes and stuff, and it's just the way that you configure it. And it only uses a couple of samples of delay, and it is a IIR2, but the thing about it is that capacitor is multiple IIR filters interleaved. So if you suddenly start it, for a moment there you've got one of the IIR filters doing something and the other ones are just blank or whatever is already in them. And then it goes through and you start working with them. But if the sound that you're using is striking enough, it might be setting it up in such a way where the IIR filters are in this unstable state. And that would be from switching it on in the middle of a mix rather than having it continually processing the sound coming in and then like going from dry to wet very suddenly. And I don't remember whether I have dry or wet on it. I can find out quickly enough though because I'm looking at the GitHub code. Let's go and see. I'm going to go and see what, and you're using a VST, I think, because you're using, yeah, if you're in Fruity Loops, you can't be using AUs, I don't think. So let's go and look at capacitor. Do we have dry wet? I'm keeping a dry sample. Yeah, capacitor has a dry wet. You should use that. Use that instead of turning it on in the middle of the mix. I bet it will work better if you do that. Because if you have it off and you literally switch it on, then you're risking funny stuff happening. Like, and it is definitely a funny thing happening. I have a 5-case sequence. I seem to be doing my 3 poles of IIR high pass, and one of them is just flipping, and the other 3 are revolving, and 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So essentially, in the middle of, oh yeah, fair enough. In the middle of capacitor is this sequence of 6 samples, and the way that I'm calculating this stuff out, I have this complicated conglomeration of things, and there is a rapid sequence of 0 to 5 states that it can be in which it's updating different things in different ways. So I have a flip-flop interpolation thing, and I have the 3-way thing, but I'm doing them both at the same time. So technically, I'm not sure that actually acts differently than if you have one that is 2-stage and one that is 3-stage. But yeah, you're starting it up in a state where all of this stuff is sort of zeroed out and doesn't have relevant data, and then suddenly dumping data in the instant you turn it on, and that can be a problem. Depending upon the settings of the filtering too, that could be more of a problem. So the idea there is you should be using the wet-dry. I bet if you use the wet-dry to do that, to switch it on, then it'll behave nicely. And that also means, you know, it is dithered after all, so you can have fully dry and it'll be behaving itself and be nice. And you can also have tiny amounts of the filtration engaged and then suddenly go to boom. Oh, Chris. Getting very serious, going 3-way. Yeah, don't turn over that rock. So yeah, I bet if you do this properly, then capacitor will behave better for you. Let's see. I wouldn't be surprised. Capacitor is a strange little algorithm. Oh, no. Here, just a moment. I'll show you. This would be fun to look at. This is Sennheiser HD600, but it's Air Windows Sennheiser HD600. So it's got this back with like aluminum tape damping it, and the inside of my headphones is completely exposed. And this is what I'm doing critical listening on a lot of the time. And I'll put that back. This is much less good. Sennheiser HD280 Pro. Ooh, Pro. And I haven't done nearly as much to it. It looks more normal. Sort of like gamer headphones kind of things. And this stuff is running this wire that didn't come with it to the speakers. And this is what the speaker wires inside a Sennheiser HD280 look like, which is not bad. These are pretty good wires. Much better than what's inside this. And then this is a wire, and this thing contains the circuitry to power a microphone element. The microphone element, and that's what you're hearing right now, is not one of those little dots. This is from out of a Rode video mic. So it's about the width of the end of this pen. It's a larger element than you usually get in these kinds of things. Yeah, and because it is a larger element, it gives me some high frequency and sort of tonal detail in things without having this bionic high frequency zing that the tiny microphone elements give you. So, you know, my least favorite thing is when you have somebody with a headset mic and they're one of those crazy headset mics where it hyper amplifies the inside noises of their mouth. I lose my mind on that stuff. I do not like it. So I made sure that mine doesn't do that. And following the chat and stuff, I do not recommend HD600 for mixing, or indeed any headphones for mixing. Although if it's something that you got to do, then you probably can do things with that. You'll just get results that don't relate to speakers. And I'll tell you why. Speakers put sound out into an acoustic space, like your room. And as such, the sound bounces around. Oh, Bernhard, I'll come back to your question since you're coming back to the question. That depends on your converters. Like, I've got a Motu 16A, and that, I believe, has DC capable outputs. In order to connect things to use DC voltage with modular hardware, what you're going to need to do is have a DAC or a multi-channel DAC that will give DC output. Otherwise, it will not work. Honestly, if you're using modular hardware, I'd recommend that you get hardware DC voltage to control, or send your outputs by MIDI, or do something other than trying to control modular stuff. Is maybe you can do it, but it just seems very suboptimal to me. Also, your converters will not put out modular voltages. You can put out the full DC voltage, and the value that it puts out could be 1 or -1. And the output voltage of your converter is not going to be modular capable. It's not going to be 1 volt per octave. It's not going to go up to the highest level. So in order to really fully use DC voltage with modular hardware, and not just like as part of VCV rack or something. I still haven't gotten into VCV rack. I'm going to have to update my computer to do it. Okay, so you know that it won't actually help you get modular voltages. In the DAW, basically what you'd be doing to use it with modular hardware outputting from a DAC is assign a channel with DC voltage on it to an output. It's not one of your monitor outputs. It doesn't go through any of your audio stuff. Instead, it's just an output on the DAC. Like you use channel 12 or something. So you're using channel 12. Channel 12 is plugged into presumably a DC voltage amplifier. It's plugged into a modular thing that can turn up the gain on the minuscule voltage that you've got. Because it's not going to be 10 volts, not even close. You're plugging your DAC channel into that modular thing that will amplify it properly. And then you would take the DC voltage channel and assign it to only that output. And that's what you would do. And then be careful not to patch it through to your playback, because that would be bad. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of using it for that. I was thinking that it could be helpful, if nobody else would make it, then I would. And also it might be helpful in VCV Rack or who knows what else. It's just one of those very basic little tools that it's like, why not have this? Joku Sekuvan has a question about CPU. Not as much as you'd think. I was already doing a noise shaping thing. That does some math. And no, you're fine. Don't worry about your English. Your English is fine. You can't put anything before the DC voltage. It's just a signal generator. So basically, you can't put anything before the DC voltage. All you can do is use the DAW to automate its slider, which is not great, but I never said that it was a good way of controlling things. I just made it available because it's like, if nobody else will do this, then I will. Who knows? Maybe it'll have a use of some kind, like test measurements and things. So how much CPU does the dithering do? Not all that much. Like, you can probably compare it, but bear in mind, this is using the Paul dither high-pass dither. And one of the special things about that, and the reason I liked it so much that I just chose to use it, is Paul dither only has to generate one random number. And I think I showed the, yeah, let's see, I'll dig it up in one of my plugins so that I can see what it is. And I'll read it off to you. Back over here. So here's what the code does. I'll explain it to you rather than talk to it. And David, you are absolutely correct. It is not something to place before every 32-bit plugin. That does nothing. That is useless. Don't ever do that. In your 64-bit Reaper, if you are saving 32-bit floats, that's where you could use it. And dither float only would be useful for that if you set the offset to 0. Otherwise, it's a bit crusher. It's basically like a bit crusher. So the CPU that the new floating point uses is just a couple of lines of code. And here's what the lines of code do. Yeah, I know, I can go and have another nap soon. Here's what the lines of code do. I'm defining a integer called exponent for exponent. I could have called it just exponent. I don't know. And this thing that follows it is part of what the C programming language lets you do. It says frexp float input sample L and the address of expon. So what that, yeah, only when you render audio at 32-bit. You can't put it in front of plugins and have it do anything useful. So, oh yeah, Bernard, you're very determined to make me drink fluids here. I have emergency in water here, so. Vitamin C drink. So frexp float input sample L expon takes the information from the exponent of the floating point number and puts it into that integer. The bit sequence becomes that integer. Now the integer does not go from 0 to whatever. Instead, it is offset by a thing. So I have to do a expon plus 62 to get it to the right zone. And then once I've done that, the expon goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, but it's supposed to correlate to powers of 2. So since it doesn't go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128, I have to go power 2 expon plus 62, and that's how that one's made into a sensible figure. So basically, I've done this funny thing to make an integer for the exponent that strips that out of the thing. I go long double dither equals rand. Rand is probably using up most of the CPU because randomizing numbers is not cheap. And then I divide it by rand max, which is a provided number by the operating system. And that times this scientific notation number, which is a very, very tiny number. And giving it a tiny number like that doesn't necessarily take any more time. It's always going to have to work with, like, if you're giving it a long double, it's going to be this long number, even if you say 2. 2 is not any easier for the computer to work with than 7.737125245533627e plus 25 is going to be the same thing as far as how fast the computer can work with it. The fact that it's more complicated doesn't make it harder for the computer. And then once I've divided by random for that, then you multiply it by this power thing, which is the exponent, and then you have your dither, which is scaled to the amount. Then, once I've made that dither number, which is the exact amount of dither that it's supposed to be, all that's left to do is go input sample L plus equals dither minus FPN shape L, and after that, FPN shape L equals dither. That is the Paul dither. It's adding a dither, and then it's subtracting the one that I used last, which works. So as a result of that, you got to bear in mind the way computers work, and it's just my little brother that's helped me with some of these things is the one that taught this to me. The computer can actually do a hell of a lot of this simple math. What uses up energy for it is keeping lots of variables, having stuff not fit into a cache. But I can sit around and go plus, minus, or whatever all day long, and it can do kabillions of those operations. Like, it's doing those 44,000 times a second. That's nothing. Nothing. It could do 44 million of those per second. It could do, thousands upon thousands of these math operations for every sample and still not really choke. It's really quite amazing how fast these things can go. So it's generating the dither that takes most of the CPU, and all of this stuff put together isn't that big of a change in how much the CPU is eating. It depends. Like, in anything where, like, certain ones like 2tape or whatever are already making a dither source, are already making a random source. I typically like to use only one random source per sample, but all the dither stuff is using dedicated random sources for that. But the answer to how much it's gonna hurt the plugin count over a big mix is probably not all that much, possibly hardly any at all. Because the dither in there is really not very, it's simpler and it's easier and there's not that much going on. The hardest thing is generating the random noise, and if the computer is running a random function that's efficient in some way, maybe not like cryptographically random, but just whatever it's using, and I'm only using just the rand function, then it's not going to eat that much time. Oh, I can't be drinking juice. Juice is that plugin making thing that I don't understand. So yeah. I am referring to the extra money for streaming for more hours. Honestly, that might be a legitimate way of making the higher Patreon rankings actually do something. Because and no, I'm not programming in Juice. I find it challenging. But that is a thing. Because it's like, I'm not willing to paywall the stuff that I'm doing that's actually valuable information. I'm just not. If I'm making a dither update and I update everything, then I'm not going to paywall and say, well, you have to pay me a lot of money in order to get this update. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to paywall any of the plugins. I'm not going to paywall any of those things, but they're there's a level where it does get involved in that kind of stuff where, and here's the thing with with, it's been a long week. My tiers for Patreon rewards are already kind of screwed up, and I'll tell you why. Because they're saying things like, at $2,000, I will do 3 plugins off of the list, and at $3,000, I'll start doing all the plugins off of the list, and at this amount of money, I'll open source this, and I'll open source that, and yeah, I've already done most of that. It's like all done already. As far as withholding the code in order to have that be a Patreon reward, first of all, nobody cared. And second of all, I went ahead and did it because when I was going to the Patreon, I was like, oh God, taking a scary plane trip. So if the plane crashes, I will want to leave all this stuff out there. So I quietly open sourced everything before I left. So the Patreon goals have technically already been reached. And if I need to make more Patreon goals, I'll have to come up with something that is beyond just like, I'm not going to open source this unless you give me money because I'm not going to open source the thing anyway. Or I'm not going to give you this plugin unless you give me money. It's like, no, I'm going to give you plugins anyway. So I got to come up with something that's relevant to what people actually get. I even had an idea as far as like a high up Patreon reward that might work. Here's the thing, I've got my laptop over there and it's got all of my code on it and it's got my list of things that are in the works to do and stuff like that. And there's a thing that some people use, I think it's called Bonjoro. And it's this thing where people who are doing Patreons or whatever can say, pledge this much and I'll do this Bonjoro for you. And basically what that means is it's for people who are really into their cell phones. And Bonjoro is basically like taking a personal call or something. That if you trigger that reward, it tells the person who's pledging on the Patreon, like, for this amount of reward, you get a Bonjoro personal message from Dave Kellett or whatever the cartoonist is. And then they get a message on their app and it says, you need to record a message for this person. So they take out the phone and they go like, oh, hi, it's Dave Kellett from Sheldon and also the movie Stripped. And I've been listening to their podcast. And this is me working in my studio. And hi, it's nice to talk to you. And thank you so much for doing the picture. And boop. And then they save it and they have sent a little private video just to that one person. So one possible thing I could do, since I don't think anybody really gives that much of a crap about me recording a private phone message, which I don't use my phone for that anyway. But if you wanted to have a really high reward where it's like, I'll do a Bonjoro, and each month you've got this high reward thing going, I will give you a private message where I show you my list of stuff that is in the works. And you can look at my notes. And that could be a thing, because then that could be relevant each month. Presumably I'm going to continue to have new notes going on because I consolidate this stuff as I need to address it into the notes. So you get a glimpse of that as it's typed in. I'd basically be opening my laptop and launching that program so that you can see what I'm referring to. And you're going, oh, hey, hi, so this is Chris, and here's your glimpse of what's going to be happening next. And then, like, scroll past it and stuff. And that could be a high Patreon reward. Then, let's see, what would the other possibility? I forgot now. But, yeah, there's something... Oh, yeah. Streaming for 4 hours instead of 2. You definitely have to let me go off and poke my fire a little bit more often. It's already gone dead on me. But that is something that could work. Oh, no, not a PDF book. You just be seeing it on the video. You're not getting a copy of these notes or anything like that. You just like because the way I'm thinking, that's not necessarily useful, but people who have like money and power and stuff, and they're like, I would like to give you large amounts of money if you could do something really special for me. And I'm like, I ain't doing anything special for you. I give everything to everybody. Coming up with something that counts as being special for people, but doesn't hurt people that are not being given the special thing. And I have issues around like reserving special things for only people who have a bunch of money to throw at me. It doesn't sit well. So I'm more likely to be like, well, tell you what, if you have a whole bunch of money, you're probably not going to be all that pumped up about like writing plugins and competing with me. And even if you did, if you MIT licensed it, it would be fine. So you could pay to have a sneak preview of what is on my to-do list effectively. And that could get distributed, but it's the kind of, I feel comfortable withholding that from people who aren't paying a bunch of money, because I don't think it hurts anybody that doesn't have the plugins yet, because they haven't made the plugins yet. It's basically like, pay a bunch of money if that's your thing, in order to get this sneak preview and know stuff that other people don't know. And you get to feel kind of special, and like supporting me with that, I mean, it's this complicated balance between being really bent out of shape about poverty-stricken people who have no resources and the incredibly wealthy people out there who aren't really involved in my thing at all at this point. And what do you do? What do you do to get those people, the whales, like the game developers call them whales? And they're all about like, okay, what can we do to take money from these people and use them, just milk them, squeeze them into juice. I don't want to hurt the whales either. I just have real hang-ups about doing all manner of stuff, especially for just only them, and withholding it from everybody else. So I think that it would be probably workable to do the sneak preview. And there's things like, when the Dither plugin setup came out the night before, because I was gonna go and play games over at my brother's on Sunday. So there was going to be a limitation to how fast I could post the video, and in fact it went up late in the night. But I got all of the uploads for the downloadable plugins and new updates.zip and everything. I got that done the previous night. I didn't say anything about it. So what I did was I posted on the Patreon and I said, oh, hi, I don't usually make posts directly on the Patreon, and I never send out the posts that send emails out. But I'm doing it this time because I just wanted to tell you I've got that update up now. Go ahead and download it. Here's the link to newupdates.zip. Also, all the little files also count as updated. And that was my idea of something that I could do special for the people that are on the Patreon that doesn't really hurt people, who can't be. Is like, here, you get a preview. If you're on this Patreon, now you're getting to download this thing before there's been a public announcement of it. I'm just privately telling you that here is all of the PC, here's the Windows, VSTs and everything. They're all ready. Go ahead, download it now. In case the server goes down from load, which is not the case, didn't happen. But that kind of preview kind of thing, it feels better for me because it's not like you have to wait very long. And giving previews of the stuff that I'm going to be working on, like a glimpse of my file in which I retain all that kind of stuff, might also be a Patreon reward for higher tiers. And lastly, I would be willing to do more hours of live streaming or different kinds of live streaming for Patreon goals. And I'm not sure whether those would be like collective goals, just overall totals of the Patreon, which is not a bad idea, or for people doing private goals, maybe for private live streams or something. I'm comfortable with that because I can't get time back. I only have as much time as I've got, and that can't be spent twice. There's only so much of me. Oh, Steinberg is not going to shut you down. I got their paperwork sorted out. They're fine. They're fine with me. I am fine with them. That's all going to be cool. But yeah, I only have so much time. I'm a Gen Xer who is more than 50 years old. I feel that being a Gen Xer is kind of like dog years, so I count as like 100. And I was wondering whether I was going to outlive my mom and dad, which it turns out that I have. But I was like, yeah, Gen Xer years are dog years. I've had a pretty rough road. So the live streaming thing is something that I'm willing to charge freaking top dollar for, because I'll do it, but I do it within controlled circumstances, and I'm not giving any more than I'm willing to. I just run on a schedule easily, so it's easy for me to like do a couple of hours, go a little bit over, whatever. But if I was to do like a 6-hour one, that'd be a much bigger investment. And if I was to dedicate add another day to the live streaming, that's asking a lot. So I'm willing to demand money for some of those things because I don't get to do them. Nobody can do that for me, and I can't make up rest. I can't make up downtime if I'm not leaving myself any's, and that's just it. And I have to be careful what I'll commit to. So extra hours of the live stream is definitely a possible Patreon reward, and maybe that'll get things moving again because I've stalled out at around $1,200, and I'm fine with that because if that's all people have, that's fine. It does leave me wondering, like, what more can I even do? Like, if this is not impressing people, I don't know what to tell you. So all I can do is just keep doing what I'm doing, but maybe the more time live streaming and giving people more hours of my attention is worth a more direct conversion between money and the thing. Because I'm not willing to make a big paywall on the ideas and the software and stuff. That is a commitment that I've made, which I care about. So I think we're about done. There's a bit of a delay on the thing, so I may or may not see it directly. It is about 1:08, so I've gone a couple of hours. Today it would cost you much more than that for me to go for another hour. I may need to go and lie down again. Or at least I'm going to shut my brain off for a while, have less going on. There may be a time when I'm able to talk through the modular system, but that would involve me setting up a mic, and it would probably involve me running the voice through crazy modular stuff or whatever. And it's not really about me having conversations with people while doing the modular thing. So this is the full engagement, and then the music thing is like listen over my shoulder while I go into the musical space. I have no idea whether tomorrow's is going to be really nice and mellow or really crazy and experimental. It could be either. I'll see what happens when I start it. And at some point, I'll start building these things and incorporating those into it. But yeah, I've seen some people get offended when I didn't respond to them while playing guitar with my back turned to them. So I don't know what to tell you. I'll work on it. In order to be able to do the music streaming and even see people's responses, I have to put like an iPad or something over here. And I can't do that yet. So there's no conversing while playing at the moment. But eventually I'll be able to see people's comments and stuff, and then maybe I'll come up with a way of responding. Or even, come up with a way of like, okay, program, type this thing in, and I've got a Raspberry Pi watching it, and then you can change the key of the, crazy stuff like that. I'll come up with crazy stuff to do, and then it'll be cool. But for the time being, I will say good afternoon to you guys. I'll see you again next week. And next Sunday is supposed to be PAF Nutty. I feel that I'll be able to do that. PAF Nutty has been slightly rearranged because I came up with a way to make it so that if you take all of the odd numbered harmonics and you crank them up positively, you get more of a square wave output. And then if you take all the even ones, same deal. So I rearranged the pluses and minuses of them in such a way that they're working more intuitively. It's still PAF90, it's still the same plugin, but I'm hoping it's a little more logical, and that does mean it'll work differently from the way people remember it, those who were able to use it. So I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.